Okay, it looks like most people are inside. Is anyone in the hallway? Class is about to start. And there will be a test. Come along. We have seats in the front. It's gotten very quiet. There are more seats in front, folks. Okay? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Harman, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center. We're delighted to welcome you for a national conversation. You're going to love this one. But first, let me thank and welcome a few of our big shots who are here this afternoon, especially Peter Kellner, who is the husband of Baroness Kathy Ashton, a former journalist at the Sunday Times. He's known for his election coverage, and he's also former president of YouGov, a British opinion polling institution. And I've already learned that if anyone wants to ask why the Brexit polling went so wrong, Peter will answer your question. We also have, or had, several board members. Some have left. I don't know if Susan Helms is still here. I hope that Barry Jackson is still here. There he is. Yeah, he just made a, drum roll. Barry Jackson is still here. Thelma Duggan is still here. Thelma? There she is. Oh, right there. Okay. And we have Natalie Reyes still here? She left. Okay. But we have others of our nearest and dearest supporters: Don O'Connell, Judy Flom, Bobby Mandel, Ginny Edlovich. Let's see here. Michael Waller. I knew we would leave a few out. And we have Diana Negroponte, the power source for the Wilson Council. And we also have Kathy Gildenhorn right in the corner. And lots of others that I have failed to recognize because I have. But my special thanks to the Wilson Center's newest fellow and my friend, Baroness Kathy Ashton. I have always been deeply impressed by Kathy. She is a stellar leader and embodies so many of the qualities I personally value most: preparation, persistence, and grace. Her stay with us started only last week, and she brings enormous wisdom and experience. As many of you know, she spent decades in public service and was deeply engaged in social policy, working for the local health authority and at the National Council for One-Parent Families. Since her appointment as leader of the House of the House of Lords, she's worked hard to strengthen the EU because she believes, as I do and most of you do, that partnership is the way we move forward. In 2008, as EU Commissioner for Trade, she struck down tariffs with South Korea and ended long-running trade disputes with Latin America and the United States. Would that we could still do that in either of our countries. That was a nonpartisan aside. In 2009, she became the first EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, who happens to be a woman. Applause. So in that role, here are just a few of her many accomplishments. In April 2013, after nearly 2 years of negotiations and mediating 10 rounds of talks, Serbia and Kosovo reached an agreement to normalize relations. Nobody thought she could do it. Later, under her chairmanship, the P5+1 reached the Geneva Interim Agreement with Iran on its nuclear program, the agreement that paved the way for the 2015 Iran deal. Most people thought that couldn't happen either. Of course, Kathy is one of the most vocal and influential examples of women's leadership. She worked to establish a comprehensive EU policy on women, peace, and security, recognized the critical work of women in conflict zones, and met with grassroots leaders around the world, from Afghanistan to Libya. In her own words, listen up everybody, quote, "You can't solve 100% of the world's problems with only 50% of the talent." Raise your hand if you disagree with that, and then leave the room. We agree. Rob, yeah, that was pretty funny, right? Okay. And as most of you know, the Wilson Center's Women in Public Service Project is working hard toward the goal of 50% female participation in significant public service roles worldwide by 2050. During her time here this fall, Kathy will help analyze Brexit and its aftermath. And so please welcome her as she joins me. We're sitting together, no speeches, for a conversation. Please welcome our newest fellow. Okay, so now I'm sitting down. And some of you missed, I showed this off at lunch, but I'm not sticking my foot up, that I have on these little kitten heels, the furry ones that Theresa May wears. This is a gesture of solidarity, but my point is I owned them before I knew that Theresa May was going to become Prime Minister of Britain. So, Kathy, let's do a primer on Brexit here. I think everybody knows what Brexit is. I think most people know that the referendum to stay lost, or the referendum to leave passed. I think they got that. I think most people know that something's going to happen in March of next year. But all kinds of terms are flying around, sort of like Joe Nye's soft and hard power about soft Brexit and hard Brexit. Maybe it sounds like a food recipe. Could you do a little primer on what could happen, what is likely to happen, and what you think about it?
First of all, thank you. It's wonderful to be your newest fellow. I think I'd employ you to do my PR, actually, Jane. So if we just rewind a little bit, the Brexit debate, many of you know that this was a commitment made by Prime Minister Cameron that I think he probably, in part, hoped he would never have to fulfill. His winning of an election outright was unexpected, not least because the pollsters told him it was unexpected. And had he been in coalition, this would probably not have happened, and certainly not at the time that it did. When the campaign began, there was clearly a big difference in those who were pushing for Britain to leave the European Union as to what that might mean. And so the first answer to your question is nobody quite knows what Brexit would look like, in part because until the negotiations begin, it's impossible to say, but also because there are different interpretations of what it means. You will read and hear people say, we're going to be outside of the EU, but we're going to be very close to Europe. You will hear people say, we want to continue with the single market, i.e. that we work as one trading area to protect industry and the City of London and so on. And you will hear at the other end of the spectrum that we should leave the single market immediately, create a completely different trading environment for the country, and you will hear variations in between. So the first answer is, the reason you're confused is because anyone watching and reading will get all of those different answers depending on who you speak to. That has an impact because for the Prime Minister who has to navigate her way through this, somebody who was part of the Remain campaign, she has to manage a situation where even within her own party, and this was very much a party issue as well as a national issue, there are people who take those different views extremely seriously and who want to see one or other outcome. So as she starts to navigate that, she has to work out a strategy for negotiation that somehow manages the big questions of economic and other things and holds together her party in a way that she knows she can take them with her into the future.
So what is the difference between soft Brexit and hard Brexit?
Fundamentally, hard Brexit means we get out now, we don't do any deals for a future relationship with the European Union, and we become, in the eyes of those who would call it a hard Brexit, a completely independent, separate nation that sees Europe over there in the distance. A soft Brexit means we stay as close as we possibly can, what you might call just outside, where we have the benefits of the single market, where we do agreements on immigration, which was one of the big issues during the campaign. I mean immigration from the rest of Europe, and where we operate as if we were almost a member, which might include paying some money into the budget for particular things, collaboration on defence, security, and so on.
Well, one of the, I think, inadequately assessed pieces of this is the EU is talked about as though it's a monolith, and it will easily make whatever its decision is. But the EU, as I think we've all learned over the years, is a fairly wobbly collection of most of the states of Europe, which holds together sometimes, not other times, doesn't really have an adequate governance mechanism at the top. If you disagree, please push back. But how do you handicap the EU being able to negotiate for all of its member states on the other side of the channel?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it could be much different to how it is, in the sense that it is 28, shortly to be 27 countries who come together at the highest level, heads of state and government, on a regular basis. But when those politicians arrive in the room, they still carry with them the weight of their domestic agenda. They don't suddenly become European animals. They are domestic animals working in a European context. And so the nature of the debate that they have is often very public, and it's often time-consuming. So getting 28 countries to the same place, despite the work of the permanent ambassadors and other ministers, does require them to work through it, and they work through it in a pretty public way. They get there, in my experience. It is extraordinary to me how often they're able to reach pretty good conclusions, make sensible policies, and collaborate on issues where there'll be a very different perspective if you're in the north of Sweden to in Portugal or Cyprus, or working in a country that is focusing on its relationships with Russia and concerns about Russia, than if you're thinking about what's going to happen in Libya as your nearest problem. Nonetheless, they still manage to do that. But you've also got the capacity through that network, through what we call the Commission, which is where they've delegated a bunch of people representing each member state, and a bureaucracy, group of civil servants underneath that, who can take decisions and take responsibility. So you've got both. You've got this political framework of ministers and heads of state and government, and you've got, if you like, the civil service bit that can operate. But they're waiting for us. They're waiting to see how Britain's going to trigger, and in a sense, what our first foray into, as I've said, this breadth of different perspectives, hard to soft, nearly in, nearly out, whatever, where we're going to land in the strategic direction that we want to take the country.
But just take a couple of the hard issues, one of which obviously is immigration. Immigration is roiling Europe and the EU. Angela Merkel has said she wishes that she had put in place a plan to integrate the million refugees she welcomed a year plus ago. And her party suffered a serious political loss because of the position she took. My own personal view, it was the moral and right position, but nonetheless, it has played out in a politically difficult way for her. So do you really think the EU can hold together on some of the tough issues that Britain is assessing as part of Brexit?
Well, the difference in the British position is that the immigration issues that Britain was concerned about were different to the immigration issues that Angela Merkel and other leaders are worrying about. And the reason for that is that from the British perspective, the immigrants that they were most concerned about were part of the European Union. And that's a combination of the feeling that a huge number of people had come into the country, very talented, very capable, had come in from Eastern European states and were working in Britain, and thereby, in their eyes, suppressing wages, maybe taking jobs, but in a sense preventing opportunity. Rightly or wrongly, that's the perspective that a lot of people who voted for Brexit had. The difference, of course, in many parts of Europe is this is about refugees who are coming from Syria, from Afghanistan, coming up from Eritrea, travelling either via Libya and the chaos that's in Libya, or coming through other routes and arriving into the European Union, particularly affecting, as you all saw in the photographs and all of the other issues, people coming through Italy, through Greece, and through countries that border the European Union, like Serbia.
So maybe it's different immigrants. I mean, in Britain it was Polish immigrants, as I remember. Eastern European immigrants. And in Europe it's those from North Africa and the Middle East. But the anti-immigrant rhetoric is fueling a lot of the populist movements in the countries of Europe, including the UK and in the United States. So doesn't that make it harder to do a deal?
I think one of the most interesting reflections I have about Brexit, and it sort of reflects a bit on your election here, is there are an awful lot of people who feel with pretty good reason that all of the things that we value about the international connected nature of our lives has not benefited them. They don't feel that they get the benefits from trade. You hear a lot about trade in a very negative way nowadays, that they feel that their wages have not increased and improved, and in the British context, many of them hadn't. They don't really feel that they get the opportunities that other people have, and in the British context, they worry about public services not being available to them. They want to see more money in our health service and believe genuinely that if we didn't pay the money into the EU, it could go directly into the health service. So it's not people being irrational, it's people from their own life experiences who don't see life in the way that we see life. And I think one of the things that's going to be very, very important for governments in my country, and I would say with humility, because I don't interfere in anybody else's, for the government here, is how do you heal that? How do you actually address these really genuine concerns that are reflected then in decisions that they make about something that actually may not be the cause and could be the answer if it were dealt with differently. And I think that you can reflect across many nations is a reality. A lot of people feel that life is not being as good. It's not as it was. Their country is not the same, and their future doesn't look very bright.
Well, that exact thing is playing out here. I think no one has missed it. And globalization is being blamed for everything, when in fact automation, artificial intelligence, and a lot of other improvements are more to blame than globalization. Globalization offers huge benefits. Many people fail to understand that. John Kerry was here a few weeks ago, for those of you who missed it, talking about the huge benefits of international trade, and I'm sure that's true in Britain as well. Couple more questions about Brexit, and well, let me turn to, you mentioned him, or you mentioned Russia, and I know you've met with Putin many times in your past role and maybe in other roles. Certainly, as we think about Europe and we think about the EU and we think about NATO, that is, if our next president still wants us to be part of NATO, as we think about all of this, how should we think about Putin? We study Putin here, but you've had probably more firsthand experience with him than anyone here.
Wow. I think I would assess Putin in the following way, that he's somebody who has an extraordinary passion and belief in his country, and believes that it is not treated in the way that it should be. I think historically he looks back over a variety of issues, such as the enlargement of NATO, such as the way in which Crimea was given to Ukraine in 1953, I think, such as the vote on Libya, of which they abstained, and he sees in those decisions and other things, a concern that he and his country were not treated as they should have been, or that promises were broken. And I think it's going to be one of the most interesting things for the next president, if I can stray into your election world, to assess how they are going to, in the best sense of this word, manage Russia. Because getting that relationship right, or working out what needs to happen, and you can have a spectrum of what you think should happen, using lots of what you might call the diplomatic toolkit, but it's going to be quite important to do it, because at the moment I think many people are really unsure as to what his ambition is for his country over the next few years. When they look at the context of what's happened in Georgia or Moldova or in Ukraine, when they think about the relationships that operate in the Security Council and the capacity of the Security Council to do things, and of course when they think about Syria. So this is going to be a big, big, big question, I think, for your next Commander-in-Chief.
And if I could just add to that, I think our Commander-in-Chief will want to rely on the partnerships we have always had with the UK and with Europe on a common approach to Russia. To the extent that sanctions have worked, if they have, and to some extent they have, to deter Russia's behavior, they work because they're international sanctions, not just U.S. sanctions.
I think that's really important, actually, and I don't see any desire on behalf of the British government now to move away from the relationship with the US at all. And actually, in foreign policy terms, I'm confident that they'll want to be very close up to working with the European Union and with others, with other allies that we've worked with on different issues over many, many years. That is important. It's also the case, of course, that in the context of sanctions in Russia, the effectiveness of the sanctions are often directly related to how close you are to the country, because your trade levels and the percentage of your economy that's actually working in that trade with that country is much higher. So the impact that Europe can have on that in that particular way can be quite high comparatively. And that's why it's very important to stick together, because it is about impact. Sanctions are a means to an end, or they're not an end. The end is, what is the relationship and how do we manage it?
And it's certainly true, even without Putin, that there is a series of security challenges facing Europe, including the UK and us. Extremism, failed states, etc., but especially extremism, that have been handled more or less together. I mean, if this Brexit negotiation goes badly, how does that affect those security ties?
You know, it's interesting, because I think above everything else, whatever happens in the negotiations, there will be a massive effort to make sure that collaboration on security continues. And I think there'll be quite a lot of emphasis on the collaboration through NATO. I don't see that that will be affected in any way detrimentally, quite the opposite. I think Britain will want to be very clear in its role in NATO and very clear in its role in the Security Council, not least because it's a way of saying we haven't turned inwards. We've made a decision about one particular aspect of how we work internationally. We are not turning our back or moving away from our international collaboration. I think you already see that in a lot of the statements that are being made.
My second to last question, because my last question is going to be for Peter, because he brings a lot of talent to this, so you're warned. And this is partly the question I'm going to ask you, too, is generational. My understanding is that the vote to remain was largely a vote of younger people who are integrated into the social media space in this world, like in ways that the rest of us aren't and can't be, because we don't have digital native brains. Some of those young people were very outspoken after the Leave side passed and said, you know, how are we going to live our lives? The openness of our lives is closing off. You are a politician, and you have long experience with this. How do you answer that?
I think it was quite, fascinating to watch how so many young people felt really distraught the day afterwards. And it is true that there is quite a generational divide for all the reasons that you can talk about. They travel more, they're more connected and so on. But it's not an absolute. And there are people, I think, who, especially in the context of how much education you are offered and have the opportunity to have, people who feel that they don't have opportunities, and they are young people as well. It's not a kind of universal truth. It's true that there is a generational gap, and Peter can give no doubt the figures on that. I think it's really hard, and that's one of the things that the government's got to do, is that in making the offer for the future, there are a number of things that have got to be resolved, economic, constitutional, in the context of Scotland and Northern Ireland and Gibraltar and all of these extremely important issues. But also, what is the offer that is going to be made to the next generation? If it's not going to be an EU passport that allows you to travel easily, to work in another country of the European Union, what's it going to be? What is going to be the deal or the arrangement that will enable people to continue to enjoy what they already enjoy as far as possible? And that's where the challenge of the whole debate, as we started, comes back to, is how do you make an arrangement that can achieve many of the things that many people want, against a backdrop of having had a decision that was made by the people that must be respected, against a backdrop of a variety of viewpoints about what that really means now for how Britain should relate to Europe, and through that, how Europe should relate to Britain.
So that's my question to you, Peter, and that is to explain, from the vantage point of a journalist and someone who understands polling, how this could have happened when it was predicted, and people were quite confident, and all the odds makers were totally confident that it wouldn't happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, the polls.
Son?
Is that better?
Yeah.
Right, thank you. The polls overall, if you average them out at the end, thought that we'd vote narrowly to remain by 51 or 52% of 48, 49 Brexit, and the result was the other way round. 48 remain, 52 Brexit. Why did they get it wrong? Well, the key fact, I believe, is that when you compare the referendum vote with last year's general election, 3 million more people voted in the referendum than had voted in the general election. And normally general elections, as here, are the ones which have the highest turnout of any contest. And the analysis of where turnout went up most has led the analysts of this to conclude that almost all of those extra 3 million votes were votes for Brexit. If you'd confined it to people who voted in the general election, we'd probably still be in the EU. And they were, and the echoes for your current election are fairly obvious, the archetypal Brexit voter, and especially among these extra 3 million, was white, was male, was over 50, and had not gone to university. What a friend of mine called the exam-passing classes voted Remain. Just as I think here, the exam-passing classes, I make this analytically, not as a moral point, the exam-passing classes are voting for Hillary. So there is this parallel. But if I may make one other point, when one looks beyond the demographics at the reasons, the two issues which were most important in people's minds, and they were interconnected, were the idea of getting control back of our country and the idea of cutting immigration. They're linked because by getting control back, the proposition is you could then reduce immigration sharply. But when people are asked about the other things that might happen, what might happen to the quality of the public services, spending on the health service, what might happen to people's jobs, people's standard of living, prospects of their kids getting a home, all the people who voted for, or almost all, 95% of the people who voted for Brexit thought that all these things would either get better or not get any worse. In other words, while when one looks now at the possible negotiations that will happen, one sees possible trade-offs. Do we think control of immigration is more important than access to the single market? There's a trade-off there. But people who voted for Brexit did not do it as a trade-off. They did not say, we know life might be a bit tough, but we value our sovereignty so much that we nevertheless will vote for Brexit. They voted Brexit thinking there would be no bad consequences, which of course means, and I will end on this point, if in a year or two's time it is clear that there are consequences, and not very nice consequences, then I think British politics could become even more interesting than it has been for the last 18 months.
Well, thank you for that chilling summary. All right, folks, it's your turn. Please raise your hand, identify yourself, and ask a question. No speeches. Way in the back. Wait for the mic.
Festim Gashi with Voice of America. I have two questions for Mrs. Ashton. What effects will Brexit have in U.S. enlargement efforts in the Balkans, specifically in the countries like Albania, Kosovo, Macedonia, and Serbia? And the second question about the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, it has been lacking progress lately. What is your assessment of that?
First of all, I think there is an expectation in the European Union that the countries of the Western Balkans will eventually join. I think when people talk about enlargement fatigue and whether Europe should continue to just get bigger and bigger and bigger, it's usually an assessment that leaves out the Western Balkans because we assume that they have to come in. Not yet, but they will have to come in. And I don't recognise that that has changed substantially. I think for some of the countries in the Western Balkans, it was a big surprise when we made the decision we did, because a lot of countries looking to join see the British as having been a country that's always been pro-enlargement. And in the context of the current discussions, I'm obviously out of office, so I don't know the detail. But I think it's really important that they do continue, because the agreement we reached was a really good one. They did it, not me. I was in the room with two prime ministers who were the bravest politicians I'd met in a very long time. I've met a few others, but they were fantastic. And they did an agreement to help normalise life for a bunch of people whose lives were pretty difficult in the north of Kosovo. And they did it without breaching their own red lines. But they need to continue the work, because it was always meant to be, and I think it's called the first agreement, because we anticipated many more. And I hope that both the EU and individual countries will help them to do that. But I also hope that they'll realise that they can do it themselves, because that's what they did.
Rob.
Thank you, Kathy. Question that follows on Peter's comment. Prime Minister May gave a kind of a hardline comments on kind of remain means remain, and it suggests sort of a hardline short game of going for Brexit. But one wonders whether, as the kind of it plays out in process and the consequences of Brexit become apparent, whether her short game kind of suggests a long game where once these costs that the polls didn't indicate people took into account become evident, that it might create political space for revisiting the issue.
Well, if you're the Prime Minister who is not elected by the country but finds yourself through a perfectly legitimate process becoming Prime Minister with a mandate from the people, you have got to show that you are absolutely determined to fulfil what you've been asked to do. And I think Prime Minister May will do that. She will push forward in trying to ensure that that will is done. And you are right that as the process goes forward, if she finds that actually the consequences play into some of the other issues that are very high on people's agenda, probably in reality higher than the EU was, which is to do with job opportunity, to do with public services and so on, that they will be very adversely affected, then she's going to have to think as prime ministers do, about how that balancing act is then taken forward. And there are loads of different scenarios that you can paint in this situation, because we are in unknown, uncharted territory. Article 50, much talked about, didn't exist until the Lisbon Treaty. There was no mechanism to leave, and nobody's ever done it before. So there are lots of different possibilities and probabilities. It's a lot of moving parts, not least the other countries who themselves have got to deal with their domestic and their collaborative efforts. So, you know, all of these things will come into play once there is a clearer direction and strategy, and once we see how those on the other side of the table plan to both keep the fact that membership of the club brings with its benefits you don't get if you're not a member of the club, and also try and keep Britain, I think, as close to the club as they possibly can.
Someone in the middle, right here.
Thank you for your thoughts. I'm Tom Adams, historian. You mentioned the argument of some of the pro-Brexit that the money that had been going to the EU could go to the health service as one argument I remember hearing. And what I'd like to ask what your thoughts on what the impact will be on the welfare state in Britain, and also its coordination of its practices with the EU.
On the side of the bus of the Brexit campaign was a figure that said £350 million a week went to the EU, which was a gross, not a net figure, and that they should go to the health service. And there's some evidence that people were swayed by that. Not necessarily that was the only reason, but they certainly felt it was important. So there's quite an expectation in some parts of the country that we will see health spending increase as we stop the money going to the European Union. The challenge, of course, is the effect on the economy, which is where you get the money from to be able to fund the health service. And the question about whether you can keep economic levels significantly higher than they are now, in reality, to be able to fund the health service more than we do now. And the health service in Britain is under a lot of pressure because we have an ageing population, and we've got better at being able to offer people treatments. So you have those dual pressures. Better treatments, more available, older population, therefore more pressure on the system itself. We'll have to see how far that plays into people's thinking as this unravels or unfolds. Already, I think, the day after Brexit, Nigel Farage, who you may have seen on the television here, did make the comment, because it wasn't him that wrote that on the side of the bus, I should add, that this was not likely to happen. This money was not likely to be able to go to the health service. And that sort of played into people's initial reactions of thinking, is this something that we've been told that's not true? But in the longer term, I think the questions about public services and the expectations, as Peter said, people have that things will not change or they will get better, are going to be really tested. Because, again, when you look at the strategy or the plan, all of the balancing act, keeping the economy moving, healthy, growing the economy at a time when the city is really unsure about what's going to happen, banks are talking about whether to stay or leave, companies are worried about the implications, Japanese industry, who sees their investment in Britain partly as a gateway to Europe, trying to work out how far they continue to invest even if they don't leave. People putting decisions simply on hold is already having that impact. And we'll see with the Chancellor in the next few weeks what he has to say about what he plans to do, and with the Governor of the Bank. So it's economically not turbulent yet, but it has all the makings of a time when we could find circumstances, especially through the negotiations, means that funding public services becomes tougher because you simply don't have enough money coming in, and they will want to think carefully about borrowing.
In the front row.
Ma'am, James Price from the Center of New American Security, for New American Security. There's been a lot of talk about other countries leaving the EU. because of this, or if they would stay put and see what happens to the UK and what kind of deal do they get. Could you please comment on what your opinion is on this and where you think it might go?
What was interesting about the day after our decision was that the popularity of some of the people like Wilders in the Netherlands or Le Pen in France, who have been proponents of their countries leaving, their popularity went down. And that was because I think the shockwave of what we had done began to reach people and make them think again as to whether this was a brilliant idea or not. I don't think that there is any reason to anticipate other countries looking to leave the EU. There are quite a lot of people who are questioning aspects of the European Union, whether the institutions are appropriate for the 21st century, how much money goes in, whether it could be better spent, all of those things that you'd expect. But I don't think that we've seen a push to follow us yet. And the reason I say yet is that part of the equation for this agreement post-Brexit has got to be one for the other countries that doesn't make them think, well, actually, I might as well be outside because it's just as warm out there as it is in here. And so for those negotiating, it is quite a complicated balance that the membership of the club, being part of the EU, brings with it things that domestic politicians can sell domestically and explain why they don't think they want a referendum or any such option to leave. And that will be reflected in part on how good a deal Britain gets. So it shouldn't be too warm out there, I think, is what we can safely say. And that's bad for us because obviously we want to be as warm as possible. But that really is going to be part of the whole of this, is making sure that the EU protects itself from it being so easy to leave, so few consequences, that others think, well, we might as well do that, or we could do that, or we could start the process and maybe change our minds. All of those things that create, as Jane called it, even more wobble in the European Union.
This side? Over here?
Thanks. Can't stand up. Hi, Morgoth Taylor from the Wilson Center. The UK played a key role in supporting EU sanctions against Russia. I'm wondering now, outside of Brexit negotiations, what role and what level of influence will the UK have in EU decision-making in the next 2.5 years that they're still a member of the EU? Thank you.
I think in some areas, actually, the influence will stay the same because it's not rubbing up against the whole Brexit debate. So I think on foreign policy, I think Britain will still be listened to and will be a big participant. I mean, they're influential on issues like that, but they weren't the only country by any means. And certainly in the European Council, it was the Chancellor of Germany who led the debate on sanctions, very clearly led it. No question who was in the driving seat on wanting to deal with this issue. I think on other issues, and you're already hearing it a bit on defence, where the Europeans are looking about to whether they can do greater collaboration. I think there's sort of exaggerated phrases being used for it, but they are thinking about collaboration. We spend 200 billion euros a year on defence, and that includes having, I think, 13 different specifications for the same helicopter. So there are lots of economies of scale, for starters, that could be looked at, that I've always felt they should look at, without taking sovereignty away from defence, which I would not believe in. So I think there's a lot of things that they want to do, and the British are sort of saying, no, you can't do that, and that's creating a bit of a rub, which I think you will see. So on some issues, it'll be very obviously, not welcomed that Britain is playing its normal British role, and on other issues, it will be very welcomed. It's interesting that the last commissioner to go in, Julian King, who I worked closely with and who's a terrific guy with a very difficult job, has been given the security brief. And that's partly a recognition that Britain plays a big role on those issues, and it will continue. And he's been very well received by everyone because they want that expertise to continue.
In the middle, in the back.
Thank you. Powell Hutton, retired. I understand Scotland is reconsidering their position with the UK. A, is that likely? Is a split likely to occur? And B, what would be the effect on the contribution to NATO, considering the submarine bases in northern Scotland?
I think that's kind of right at the end of the track of the problems that would be created by Scotland leaving. But you're right to raise it. The Scottish referendum happened, the issue was put to bed, everybody sort of calmed down from that, and then Brexit allowed it to reopen. So there's quite a lot of anguish in a number of quarters in Scotland that an issue as important as this has now been resurrected on the back of this. And although I think the population in Scotland presently would prefer to continue with the decision that they'd already made to stay, that is not impossible to see overturned if negotiations do not go as well as they might. A bit like people in Britain felt safer or better off or had a more positive feel about doing something which was a leap in the dark. So too, it's not impossible to see that reflected in Scotland. And I think these issues, not just Scotland, but I think the border with Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement and the issue of Gibraltar, these are big constitutional questions that for a Prime Minister will be very important to resolve and may not look as big as the economic ones, but actually will be incredibly important. And one of the issues that will play into that is what happens to Scotland as a nation, if that ever were to happen. What would its relationship to NATO be? It would be leaving, if it ever did, in the context of wanting a preferred relationship with the European Union, because that would be the reason, if you like, why a second referendum was taking place at all, and so it would play into that. But what the reality would be in the end, I don't know. I think nobody's quite sure how that plays into relationships like NATO and so on. Whether Scotland would seek to be a separate nation, who knows? I mean, I want the United Kingdom to stay united, so I hope it doesn't happen. But I think it's not impossible to see circumstances where you would get to the point where at least a referendum might be called, whatever the outcome of that.
Diana. I guess Ginny.
Thank you,
Ginny
Diana.
Adlovich. I didn't even see you.
I have a question about the economics again. We've talked about the political and social upheaval.
Talk into the mic.
I'm sorry. We've talked about the political and social upheaval of Brexit. There are a lot of comparable situations around the globe, and especially looking at the American election. There is 40% of the population that is dissatisfied. Regardless of the election results, the 40% of the population will remain dissatisfied. Britain has the same issue with Brexit. There's a significant portion of the population that's dissatisfied. Without global cooperation, without domestic cooperation, it seems like we're going to go through a very volatile period of time. What would you recommend, especially among trading partners, for the next 2 years with this volatility? How is there going to be cooperation within and without from different governments?
I think international trade is absolutely vital for the economies of the world and the world economy. And we've got to avoid falling into the horrible trap of thinking that because we haven't sold it very well as a proposition, that it's wrong. The problem that I see in my country is that this is a real wake-up call for politicians who are domestic. I've never quite been one. I'm not quite sure what to... I get these funny titles, but I'm not really a politician. To really understand why people feel the way they do about their lives, what's going on. And it's not the fault necessarily of external forces. It's certainly not the fault of trade per se. But it is the fault of our inability to recognize that because things change and our global economy and domestic economy changes, so too the training people need, the education people need, the opportunities people need, the ability to travel to work and so on. All of these things need to be reflected upon and changed. So if you are somebody who is in an industry where the nature of the way that the world has changed, steel has been a good example in Britain, you do need to have other options. But you also need to have the capacity to benefit from the technological changes that we have. I remember before there was an iPad. I remember before, you know, when I bought my first little, what do they call, iPod mini on a trip to San Francisco, it was pink. And I thought this was the coolest thing on earth. I had no idea what to do with it. I looked at it for quite a long time until my kids said, Mum, you do this with it, it plays music.
Yeah.
Okay. But, you know, that technology and the technology of Android phones has revolutionized so many things. We don't know where the next ones are coming from, what they'll look like. But the real challenge is, how do we make sure that our populations are able to benefit from the opportunities that change will bring? And it is absolutely a huge wake-up call for domestic politicians to get out there and sell the things that we know to be good and to deal with the things that are happening in people's lives. Give them the opportunities, help them deal with those challenges, whatever age they are, whatever lack of education they've had, you know, to find ways to offer it to them.
Well, do you think there are good answers to that? Do you think going forward that there will be opportunity for everyone in the world, given the youth bulge, given the fact that I think it's in Africa in the next 30 years, the population in Africa alone will double because of their birth rate? Or the growth, no, that's not right. The growth, half of the growth in the world population in the next 30 years will be in Africa.
Yeah.
It's a staggering number of people. Are those people, no matter what you do to the schools, no matter how many little pink toys you give to 2-year-olds who can use them much better than we can, are those people going to have opportunity?
Well, their opportunity is our opportunity. You know, where countries are able to grow and develop, they become our trading partners. We sell them our things. We make jobs domestically. So the jobs that will be created in America will be partly created because you've got trading relationships with nations whose economies are growing. And if we have a lot of young people, we need to find things for them to do, because there isn't really a very good alternative to having a huge number of young people with nothing to do and no future. We've seen in microcosm some areas of the world where that can happen. I saw it when we looked at the whole issue of piracy off the coast of Somalia and discovered many of them were teenage boys who got $10,000 for getting hold of a ship versus $1 a day, if they were lucky, in a program that might or might not work. So magnify that, magnify it again and again and again, and you see the scale of the problem if we don't do it. It's not impossible. There are a lot of things that need to be done, both domestically in our countries and internationally. There are plenty of roads to be built, bridges to be fixed, things to be done, opportunities provided, technology to be created, breakthroughs in medical science, artists, dancers, scientists, teachers, poets. There's lots of things that we could do with. We don't have a surfeit of everything. And that means creating an environment where we are able to support countries to develop that. And it is also, back to where you started, about thinking about tackling migration sensibly and effectively, and working out how we're going to create opportunities for people domestically and internationally that will help both to thrive.
Gotta say, that was a totally brilliant answer. All right. More questions in the back.
Alex Grand, Wilson Center. I was hoping you would expand on Northern Ireland, because as I understand it, the type of EU-UK border is going to have a radical effect on the peace process in Northern Ireland, and has the potential to seriously anger various constituencies depending on where it's placed. You know, if there's a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, the Republicans are angry. If there's a hard border between Northern Ireland and the UK, the Protestants are angry. So how do you see that playing out, and what's kind of the future for Northern Ireland down the line? Does this keep them in the UK or push them more towards United Ireland? Like, how does this play out?
Well, you were hoping I'd expand. I was hoping you'd ask, because it's a good question. I think in the referendum, I'm looking at Peter, the closer you got to the border in Northern Ireland, the higher the percentage of people who wanted to stay in the EU because they saw the consequences. And the Good Friday Agreement, which is the basis, as you know, for the kind of settlement, relies on the European Union's existence, on the fact that the border is easy for people to move across. It's not a hard border. So for the Republicans, it's part of one thing. And for others, it's definitely about two. The biggest question that we hear about, and when Peter arrived from London to join me yesterday, he raised it with me, is about trade. That there's real concerns about what this means for what has effectively been an open border for companies who are operating on both sides of the border. And how that's going to work is going to be quite dramatic. So for the Prime Minister of Britain, she's going to have to look really carefully about this because she does not want to bring back a pre-Good Friday Agreement world. People will get stressed and angry about this, and it will provide opportunities for people who wish to cause trouble, inevitably, and it could have a dramatic effect on the economy in both directions. So I think it's a huge question. And it's, you know, everybody quite reasonably focuses on the economic issues for Britain and the challenges of that. But I think these sort of constitutional questions are really, really important and really big, and perhaps especially big for Conservative Prime Minister because of their strong stance on many of these issues, that they're going to have to resolve this properly, and that covers Scotland, Northern Ireland and Gibraltar.
You know, it just points out that as hard as those issues were, the issues that follow them are even harder. So if we unravel the issues of the past, then we're geometrically making this staggering. We'll keep the Wilson Center in business forever. Diana.
Diana Negroponte, the Wilson Center. Thank you, Lady Ashton, for sharing your thoughts, your analysis with us. You have a gap, and that's called Parliament. What role does it play? When should it play it?
So there's a court case, as you know, Diana, currently going on as to whether the triggering of Article 50, i.e. the moment at which Britain launches into the 2-year clock-ticking timetable in which it needs to negotiate its way out, whether that trigger should be triggered by the government or by Parliament. And the reason that it's important is because the referendum is an advisory referendum in theory. It doesn't have, if you like, in a legal sense, a requirement upon Parliament to take note of it, other than to take note of it. And the issue will come down to two things. It will go to the Supreme Court, and it will come down to two things. One, that because the Supreme Court in Britain is not supreme over Parliament, Parliament is supreme, the Supreme Court will need to look at the basis on which the decision was taken to hold the referendum. It's called, when I was Leader of the Lords and I did a lot of constitutional work, it's called what was in the mind of Parliament at the time that they took the decision. And they will read the debates to see whether there was any suggestion that had the referendum gone in this direction, it would come back to Parliament for decision. They're unlikely to find that that's what Parliament was thinking. The other side of it, which is growing in importance, is the question of how far one decision can undo all the legal decisions that Parliament has taken in the past. And so many of the decisions Parliament took in the past are part of the interwoven nature of its relationship with the European Union. And so the courts will have to decide whether this trigger can undo all of that legality of the past in one go without Parliament actually agreeing to it. And those are going to be the arguments, I think, on both sides. We hear that the government's getting more nervous that it may go in the other direction. And the reason that matters is because on a free vote, all things being equal, parliamentarians would vote to stay in the EU by a majority. I don't think they probably would, because I think they would feel that the referendum should be respected, but nonetheless it's a possibility. I think what more people in Parliament are now looking for, whatever happens with this, is the vote on the negotiating agreement. In other words, for Parliament to have its say on the proposals that will be put forward for what Britain should do in the future. And I think their Parliament is on pretty solid ground personally, and the Prime Minister's already said there needs to be debates at least on this. But if you watched Nicola Sturgeon over the weekend, she's pretty angry at the lack of, in her view, engagement with Scotland precisely on how this negotiating package is going to be put together. So I think this is we're going to be, and you're right to point it down, this is where the action's going to be for the next months as scrutiny and discussion and debate and the prospect of a vote come to the fore.
I think we'll take I see 3 hands up. We'll take those, and then I want to give, if time permits, Peter the chance to ask a final question to his wife. So please, a simple question, and it can be, honey, who's making dinner tonight? But
who's paying for dinner tonight?
3 simple questions, and Kathy will answer, and then Peter.
Hi, Brett Fortnum from Inside U.S. Trade. Obviously, the triggering of Article 50 will cause all sorts of interesting implications in terms of UK and EU trade policy, whether it's a renegotiation of the UK's obligations at the WTO, its relationship with the EU. Where exactly does the US and a potential FTA fall into that window in terms of UK priorities, and like, just is there any sense of a timeline for what we'd be looking at?
That was a simple question. All right, Kent, right there.
Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. Theresa May seems to be taking some different directions in the British economy, reviewing foreign direct investment coming into England, new kind of corporate governments that might be the German model, bringing stakeholders in, and she talks openly about industrial policy. Do you see this kind of shift going forward?
And the final question was right here. Yeah.
Thank you, Lady Ashton.
Apologies to others.
Evan Fury, Statoil. Does the UK have any allies in the EU on whom it can call as it navigates this negotiation?
Good questions. Okay, so trade and an FTA with the US. Britain would love an FTA with the US. It would love it now. It would love to start negotiating now because it would be a sort of vindication of Brexit. You know, look, we get to trade with our biggest and most important partner. We don't need the kind of European side of things. But I think President Obama made it clear that that's not on for now, and we shall see what happens in the future. In the context, though, of Britain's general behaviour on trade, it first of all has to get its new relationship with the WTO sorted out. They're being helpful, and they're saying, you know, we'll try and help you through it, but it does require, I think, the unanimity of 167 countries, including Russia and a few others that may be less keen on us right now, to do it. So watch this space. I mean, I think it'll be okay, but you can't be sure. And until we've got that, we can't even begin to start negotiations. We also have to do a negotiation on a new trade deal with the European Union. And I just throw in that even if you could do that at the same time as you're leaving, which is not strictly allowed, you can't negotiate as a member with yourself. You have to be outside. The leaving is a qualified majority, but the new agreement is unanimity. Back to Gibraltar, Spain, back to issues for Ireland if they don't think it's right with Northern Ireland, back to anything else you like with any country that decides to use this as a bit of leverage.
How many people knew that? Wow. See?
I know a few things, not many.
Yes. And your bestie in Europe, Britain's best friend in Europe?
Well, I'm going to do industrial policy. I think she's signalled from the day she became Prime Minister on the steps of Downing Street that she saw herself as an inclusive Prime Minister that was keen to be thinking carefully about issues like how our economy works, whether people should be more represented in business and so on. And I think that's genuinely where she would like to go. The truth is, though, that the next months are going to be completely consumed with the Brexit negotiations. So I don't think I would give up on her wanting a new sort of industrial policy, but I think it's going to be harder to just deliver that right now. And have we got any friends in Europe? Yeah, well, we sort of do. I mean, I was, you know, when I was there, I've had this kind of thing where I said to people, so you feel sorry for me. I was the first woman ever sent by Britain to be a commissioner. And I was the first ever woman trade commissioner. And I was the first ever woman high representative, because I was the first of that. So the first Brit as a woman, but I'm also the last. And as a woman, I'm used to being first, I'm not used to being last.
Here, here. Peter.
So,
Peter, keep that in mind before you ask your question.
So we do have friends. We have people who want very much Britain to be successful and close, and Germany is one and France is another. They didn't want us to leave. They were heartbroken at the idea that we would go, because they see us as a solid ally and friend. And people who've actually worked in the European Union, including ministers, get that quite quickly, which is why all of those ministers, pretty much, who were very engaged in Europe, ended up being pro-Remain. So lots of friends, but they've also got to protect themselves domestically, and they've also got to make sure that this is not a reason for them to leave too. God.
This better be good.
Well,
better be
this
good.
may be a question.
Question, not a speech, please.
A question to both of you, but you may want to leave hanging in the air. We had the British referendum. A few weeks ago, we had the Colombian referendum that some of us hearing about last night, the Colombian ambassador, which unexpectedly produced a vote against the agreement with FARC. Italy has a referendum in a few weeks' time on a constitutional change, which is actually quite popular, but the polls suggest that Renzi might lose because people are using it to protest against him. Should we, I wonder, be reviewing, in an age when politicians are so unpopular, should we be reviewing the health of representative democracy around the world and what could be done to revive representative democracy? Because I think direct democracy is increasingly becoming a curse.
Oh, a simple question. You'll pay for that.
Yeah. Go.
I'm
thinking,
I think in an age when we are so capable of connecting directly with people, it's not impossible to imagine that you could find ways to reconnect more effectively. But I think it's about some pretty fundamental stuff. Back to my point about the divide in the nation that I see reflected here too, is people are asked to make decisions on things that they've actually elected representatives to do, and they should expect those representatives to become experts and do it. And the representatives need to take responsibility, along with governments, for explaining what on earth it's all about. It's no good me sitting here saying trade's a good thing if you've just lost your job in the local steel factory because steel you think is being produced and imported from China. We have to get much, much better at explaining it, and not treating people like idiots, by the way, in the process, but being real and realistic about people's right to know what it is people do on their behalf.
And I would add a couple of things. First of all, that was a very good question. I'm proud of you. But the U.S. does not have a direct democracy. We have a republic. And I think Donald Trump is learning the hard way that just getting the mob excited is not going to win the presidency. You also have to put the machinery in place to get the electors to elect you. And I think he forgot part two, or we'll see if he forgot part two. And I think as we are learning more, at least in this country, about the changes in our, the anger in our electorate on both sides, I think some of us are happy that we have a republic and not just a direct democracy. But I would add to Kathy's very good answer a couple of things, and she said this, but I would put it a slightly different way. Leadership. Those elected, and actually those appointed, have to step up and lead. Being a leader often means people get angry with you. But hey, guess what? If you have a vision to go forward and you explain yourself clearly, you might not win, but you certainly will get respect. And too often, at least in this country, I would say this, on a bipartisan basis, we have survivors, not leaders. And the goal is to win the next election, not to lead. I don't think that's a worthy enough goal. And the other piece that has fallen apart around the world, and social media drives this because social media is anonymous and you can say whatever you want, is the decline of civility. And the ugliness and anger and choice of words and screaming matches are just awful. And I was in the last debate not in it, I was there at it. The room was a meat locker, like many of the rooms at the Wilson Center. Although this room is warm now, Adam, if you can hear me. But at any rate, it felt more like a prize fight than a debate. And I think both sides said some important, interesting, substantive things, but the conversation was more about provoking each other, or in many ways about that, than it was about adding quiet conversation and explaining differences. So as my voice fails because of the meat locker character of this place,
I know.
I want to thank you, Kathy, for enlightening us and for being here.
Good luck to me.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Pleasure, my dear.